Hello, it's Cried here, with the real Elden Ring patch 1.13 patch notes. Most changes are good, and many of them were already expected. Like I mentioned in my hand-to-hand breakdown, the new weapon types have a poise damage oversight, and it's fixed. Honestly, the only surprise for me is Carrion Sovereignty is not nerfed, so I guess my weapon art crit build will need to wait a bit longer to get updated, because I feel like this weapon art is a bit too OP and will get nerfed eventually. Anyways, back on topic with the PvP adjustments first. I'm going to show some poise values here. Like I guessed, hand-to-hand's poise damage is roughly the same as claws and fists now. And light great swords obviously do more poise damage than straight swords, while the backhand blade is in the same category as straight swords and katanas. I'm linking the motion value sheet in the description of this video. For these kinds of changes, it's really easier if you just take a look at the new values yourself. They increase the poise damage of dual-wield attacks for the lighter weapon types. I'll use straight swords as an example, but the buffs for the other weapon types all fall into the same reasoning. As you can see, pre-patch straight swords did 132 poise damage on many of its moves. This means that with our max poise sets and Bogle Talisman, you will be able to poise a hit of their attacks because you have 133 poise. This change is to make sure that there isn't a max poise meta for PvP. But they actually changed some other values as well for these weapon types, not just dual-wield attacks. For example, offhand thrusting swords went from 88 poise damage to 104. Again, take a look at the MV sheet. Claws of Knights throwing attacks got a poise damage buff, as it was suffering from the same issues as the new weapon types. Don't worry, this change does not buff Scattershot Throw. The Backstep Talisman and the All-Crucible version got a nerf from 11 iframes to 7, which will make it a bit more difficult to fish for backstabs. This is also part of the iframe nerf for the DLC stuff this patch. But first, the Savage Lion's Claw. The first line is talking about the tracking, while the second line decreases the first hit's damage level from 3 to 2. This nerfs the stagger from 35 frames to 25. There are more changes later to this skill, not just for PvP. Next, Raging Beast, an Ash exclusive to Beast Claws, has its iframe nerfed from 8 to 6. This didn't feel needed, to be honest, as Beast Claws aren't particularly good in PvP. Blind Spot, though, definitely deserves the nerf, and it got hit fairly hard. Its iframes decreased from 10 to 5, which is quite impactful. A big reason this Ash was annoying was because it was difficult to punish the startup when the enemy is dashing. Palm Blast's hyper armor is nerfed, but this isn't that big of a deal. The incoming poise multiplier for PvP has been reduced from a 50% reduction to a 30% reduction. The base hyper armor is still 700, so even if you're naked, you still get 1000 hyper armor now, as opposed to the previous 1400. Not a big deal in most scenarios. There are 2 spell changes exclusive to PvP too. Miriam's Vanishing's iframes got reduced from 28 to 16 frames. Previously, you were basically invulnerable during early magic cast window. Now you can actually be hit out of it. For the Knight's Lightning Spear, the initial Lightning Spear's damage is increased by 40%, while the little ones are decreased by 20%. The third line says decreased poise damage of all spears generated by this spell. This is wrong, as the poise damage is actually doubled. But upon even more careful examination of the Japanese patch notes, the third line actually reads a decrease in damage level. The uncharged spears have their hit stun decreased from 2 to 1, and the charged ones have their hit stun decreased from 3 to 1. So they mistranslated the patch notes and also completely forgot about the poise damage increase. They basically made it easier to stagger with this incantation, but also stuns you for a shorter duration when you do get hit. Now onto general balance adjustments, starting with the light greatsword. For some reason, the first charged heavy attack of Light Greatsword used to only have hit stun level 1, when even its second charged heavy, or Straight Sword's first charge heavy, has hit stun level 2, so they buffed it to hit stun level 2. Increase the stats and status of NPCs. Okay, sure, next. Increase the attack power and damage negation of summoned spirits, excluding Mimic tier when above level 5 and 8 blessings. These are the full change in numbers. The later levels now give quite a bit of buff to your spirit's ashes. The Mimic tier still uses the 1.12 numbers, but they're definitely pushing for more Pokemon trainers, and not just Mimic tiers, especially with a bunch of these changes to other spirit ashes mentioned later. If it isn't obvious enough, the most common change is will no longer stagger as easily, which makes them a lot better during bosses. Anyways, a bunch of spirit ashes got buffed. Unless someone makes a book request, I'll probably never dig deep into spirit ash myself though. Onto some weapon changes, starting with the crossbow and ballista. These new ones really got a bunch of tuning, with the repeating crossbow having the highest increase in attack here. But do keep in mind, later in the patch notes, repeating fire is nerfed to make sure it isn't too OP with the attack power changes. Repeating fire is nerfed by 24.4% for the physical portion only. If we take something like the Bloodbone Bolt and run the calculation, you will still end up doing more damage with the changes. The spread crossbow also has a status nerf mentioned later in the patch notes. This is a 20% status nerf, so I doubt it's enough for it to stop being annoyingly powerful. Shield of Knight's physical negation was increased from 55 to 60. Later in the patch notes, its weapon art is also buffed. If you counter immediately, the weapon art deals a bit more magic damage and 5 more stance damage. A nice buff, but I had hoped for a bit more guard boost. This is a big one. Euphoria users are in a state of euphoria. Did I seriously just make that joke? Yes, I did. Anyways, the Holy AR buff of Tier 1 is greatly increased, and the Tier 2 got a decent chunk of buff as well. More importantly, it is roughly around 50% easier to obtain the buffs now. Its final note on increased duration of the luster restoration effect is actually done by decreasing the decay of the luster. Since the decay is cut in half, it basically means that the buff lasts twice as long. This difficult to find hidden weapon definitely deserves to be good, especially with its unique gameplay. Yes, I said good, not OP, but you're definitely going to see a lot of Euphoria is OP videos. Actually, someone linked me one already. I gave content creator Y another try because he is supposed to be credible. While I can say he is really fast, his accuracy seems to be inversely correlated with his speed. Whenever someone links me one of his videos, he gets even the simplest numbers he can easily check wrong. I mean, sure, make up some stance damage, because who is going to call him out on that when it's difficult to verify? But getting even the base holy attack buff wrong? How low effort is that? Since this seems to be a frequent occurrence and not an honest mistake, I don't feel bad about calling him out. Do watch the numbers you're getting from that channel. The Golden Lion Shield got a significant increase to its guard boost to make it a more attractive option, on top of its unique weapon art. Just the unique ash alone definitely didn't sell me on this one, so this is great. Golem Fist got a hitbox to the fist itself, but only on the two-handed charged heavy. As you can see, the other heavy attacks don't have it, but if you're close enough with the two-handed charged heavy, you can get in multiple hits. The Smith script Great Hammer's change to the throwing portion only affects the one-handed uncharged spin, so it is quite the insignificant buff. And they lied, because they changed the poise damage of the projectile too. Ailment Talisman now immediately decreases status buildup after proccing, in addition to increasing your resistance. And they also buffed the Clarifying Horn Charm specifically. Not entirely sure why on this one. In addition to the PvP changes I've mentioned earlier, the Savage Lion's Claw got a small increase to its damage and poise damage. This skill actually still loses to Lion's Claw in terms of poise damage per second, but beats the Lion Claw on most other aspects. I might do a deep dive into this later with some other similar skills. Swift Slash's distance is reduced, and recovery time is extended by 7 frames. Told you the damage nerf wasn't going to be enough. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out in PvP though, because Backhand Blade's poise damage is fixed, even if Swift Slash is nerfed. Overhead Stance is buffed for PvE. They did this by increasing the damage but reducing the PvP only modifier. This skill didn't feel particularly powerful, while also only being limited to the Great Katana, so this change is nice. Aspects of the Crucible Wings got more than a damage and hyper armor buff. It now has different values depending on the weapon type you're using. But regardless, it is a buff across the board. The hyper armor is not only increased from 120 to 500, it also comes out earlier, especially for the Twin Blades version. Light Speed Slash's bullet scales to the attack of this weapon now. This is kind of weird, because the additional light bullets now deal holy, magic, and physical damage. Yeah, not a fan of calculating this one. Rancor Slash was buffed for both of the spirit weapons. The bullet MV is slightly increased, while the stamina damage only applies to the slashing portion. This definitely felt like it needed help to be a unique version of Sword Dance. I don't think it's quite there yet. Revenger's Blade can make really big turns now. This is quite good at catching a target who is running away, and even for roll catching. The Horned Warrior Sword got the same treatment as Overhead Stance, the damage buff in PvE, and a change to its PvP modifier to do roughly the same damage. Same thing to the weapon swing portion of the Horned Warrior's Greatsword. The bullet portion is untouched. Weed Cutter cuts weed faster, so it's even better for cleaning trash mobs. Poe Blade of the Bud received its much needed hyper armor buff on its weapon art. It isn't super armored though, so some skills can just knock you out of the animation, even if you do have 600 hyper armor. They actually buffed Red Bear Hunt's damage by roughly 10%. They also gave it 400 hyper armor, which gives Beast Claw's build an option for hyper armor. This is huge for my Rugalia's Ravager build. Definitely check that one out now if you're interested in a double Beast Claw build. Rancor Shot's status buildup is nerfed by 20% for poison and rot, and 40% for all other statuses. To be fair, it was kind of strong as an upgraded barrage. The Torch got a status effect buildup nerf to its weapon art of 0%. The status NV remains the same, but maybe the frequency of overlapping madness application is changed. Onto the spells. Glintblade Trio got a pretty decent buff which it desperately needed. This was barely doing more damage than the base Glintblade, so these numbers should have been unreleased numbers to be honest. Blades of Stone got a quite interesting change. Pre-patch, charging this skill basically meant that you summoned the stones thrice instead of once, effectively making this one of the most valuable spells to charge up because you suddenly tripled your damage, which also meant that the uncharged version wasn't very appealing. They buffed the uncharged version and front-loaded the charged version's damage while keeping it about the same amount of damage. With the attack range and speed buff, this is a formidable spell. The Impenetrable Thorns nerf is very much expected. This spell summoned 3 thorns that hit thrice each. With the base 72 bleed buildup, you were looking at 648 bleed without any arcane scaling. Add on arcane scaling and you break 1k bleed buildup per cast easily. I thought they would make it so that each thorn can hit only once, but they ended up nerfing the numbers instead. A 76% nerf to bleed buildup, 50% nerf to raw damage, and a 66% poise damage nerf. The spell is still fine. you're still easily looking at 250 to 300 bleed buildup, depending on your arcane with the maternal staff. It just isn't OP anymore, as it was always doing thrice its intended values. Rings of Spectral Light and Vortex of Putrescence both got a buff. The damage to Rings of Light got slightly increased, but I think the selling point is the 26% increase in Frostbite buildup. Funny enough, this spell is still bugged with the Godfrey icon. Vortex of Putrescence was already a decent spell before this buff, but I can totally understand the Frostbite buff. With this spell, you're more likely to just kill your enemies before seeing the Frostbite proc, so I'd say this is a fair one. Some of the crappiest incantations got a buff. Minor Erdtree's healing got a 48.6% increase, and the interval is reduced to make sure you get more out of its effect when you just pass by it. Land of Shadow got a buff to tracking, but I'm pretty sure you can still strafe this in PvP. I would give Spyra a radius buff, as the incantation is still quite crap. I understand why Watchful Spirit is weak, since it has such a low FP cost. I would take more FP cost, if that's what it'll take to make them buff this incantation's damage. Divine Beast Tornado got a few buffs. The damage is increased, and you are able to knock enemies up. However, the knock-up only applies to the charged version of this incantation, and only to the few weak enemy types. Oh, we got a new incantation called Rain of Fire. I remember them previewing this incantation's animation about a month ago on DLC release. It's nice that players could obtain the incantation just for the animation first. In all seriousness, this incantation had a bug where many of the rain didn't hit, and they also buffed the damage numbers. There were 2 motion values that randomly hit high or low. Now they do the same damage on every hit, and we finally have the usable version, which actually makes it pretty good against big bosses. Roar of Rugalia got a pretty big buff. If you've watched my Beast Claws video, I mentioned that this was crap. The biggest buff to this incantation is actually its poise damage. The full charged roar now deals 42 poise damage, which is a huge 280% increase. The raw damage of the charged version is also increased by roughly 2.4 times the original, and the uncharged version got a large increase too. Very nice change. Furious Blade of Onspok got a slight damage increase, but more importantly is that its status buildup was bug fixed. It now builds up 60 bleed per hit over 2 seconds, sort of like how Bloodflame Blade works. This does not scale to arcane, which is why you'll feel pretty disappointed if you tested it with a high arcane setup on Dragon Communion Seal. It's a better tool for builds that don't go over 45 arcane. The Rotten Butterflies got a buff. The initial zone builds up quite a bit of Scarlet Rot before the butterflies even explode, thanks to the shortened interval of rot application. But it still provides no hyper armor, and this incantation also costs 48 FP, so it isn't great. Okay, and some more bug fixes that I didn't already cover with the other points before I end this video. Torrent's revival got changed. Everyone is happy. Easier to summon NPCs in some fights, like everyone's favorite archer in the dragon fight. They fixed a bug where you can shoot greater ammunition with just a basic bow. If you know this exploit, you know it, and if you don't, it's alright. Doesn't exist anymore, like the chainsaw bug as well. Circlet of Light finally buffs Light of Mikela by 10% damage. This doesn't work in PvP though, because of the holy bug I just covered. Also, they changed Dryleaf Seal's description, as this was not supposed to buff the Light of Mikela, but the Golden Ring of Light incantations that it was already originally buffing. Jump chain casts are fixed, like the Catch Flame into Magma combo. Just a bunch of great exploit fixes this patch, and I think that's about all the important bug fixes. Tell me if I missed any big ones. Like and subscribe for more real patch notes. If you want to support my work, please consider buying my fantasy novel or donating to my Patreon down below. With a book purchase, You can also request a topic from me, Krite, signing out.